Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at chronology and the birth of Jesus in our continuing study of New Testament backgrounds. We go to the year 525 when Pope John I asked a monk by the name of Dionysius to regulate and plan out when would be the days of Easter, when would those be celebrated, and his resulting work ended up in a new calendar. There were already some means that were in use. They would sometimes refer to the year ever since the founding of the city of Rome. The city of Rome had been founded in 754 BC. They would also sometimes date back to the reign of Diocletian, who had been one of the Roman emperors. And so, with 754 being year one, Dionysius suggested a new calendar that would make that would be the beginning. That's when they thought Jesus had been born. I think he missed it by a few years, but he was trying his best with what he had. And so the year 1 AD would then be the year 754 of the old Roman AUC, in other words, the date of the year of the founding of the city of Rome. Um, and then year two would be the next year, and so on. And any year before that would be 1, 2, 3, 4 BC. That idea, so you have the idea of before Christ, and those years after would be the year Anno Domini, that is the year of our Lord. And notice there's no year zero. It goes from 1 BC to 1 AD and all the way up to today's year. Now, more recent scholarship has determined that Herod the Great ruled from 40 BC, and actually he had a little bit of a he came to power, and immediately there was a revolt. Some Parthians came in and assisted the Jews in this, and he was actually driven out, barely escaped with his life, made it all the way back to Rome, and was there proclaimed by the Roman Senate to be the king of the Jews. He came back and regained his kingdom by about 37 BC, and then ruled from then until his death in what we call the year 4 BC. We can sort of narrow that down to specifically, as Josephus mentions, a lunar eclipse just prior to his death, shortly after, I believe it was shortly after the Passover, so it was in the spring. And sure enough, there was a lunar, at least a partial lunar eclipse around that time, and that sort of helps us cement those dates pretty exactly. And so I think we can stand on good footage. And of course, remember Acts chapter 2 has Herod the Great still alive at the time of the birth of Jesus. So the birth of Jesus would have been sometime prior to the spring of 4 BC. Now, Luke chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, we read that in those days leading up to the birth of Christ, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. And then verse 2 gives, by way of explanation, this was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, notice the two names that are mentioned, Caesar Augustus, this is Octavius Augustus. Augustus was actually a title, the nephew of Julius Caesar, who was his heir apparent, and ultimately came to power and then became the first Roman emperor. And notice he makes a decree. Now, we don't have copies of that specific decree. We do have references to other censuses that were taken, and indeed it eventually became a practice that a census would be taken in order to determine which provinces had how many people, because that's how taxes were regulated. And this became actually eventually an established process. It was apparently just beginning here. But we don't have a record of this census, but we're told it's at the time when Caesar Augustus, now that's a very large area where he was emperor, but more specifically, this was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, some problems arise with the census. Like I said, we don't have a record of a census while Quirinius was governor of Syria. He was governor of Syria in the year 6 to 7 AD. And that's much too late for the birth of Jesus if Jesus was alive at the same time as the while Herod the Great was alive, because Herod the Great died in 4 BC. That's quite a bit earlier. To make matters worse, as I said, there's no earlier recorded census, and there's no known census while Quirinius was governor. I said eventually you'd have a series of censuses, but there's none that take place in that period while he was governor. Now, some solutions have been proposed, and they're not all right. Let me just say they can't all be, because some of them are mutually exclusive. First of all, it's been proposed that it's been suggested that the passage can be translated to read, "The census was taken before Quirinius was governor of Syria," but that's not a natural reading of the passage, and so I would personally, I could be wrong here, but I would personally reject that proposal. Secondly, another proposed translation reads that this census was before that, while Quirinius was governor of Syria. In other words, there was a census when he was governor of Syria, but this is before that. Again, that's not a natural reading. You have to sort of force the translation into that. I don't think that works very well. But I think it is accurate when we point out that the term that Luke uses when he speaks of Quirinius being governor, actually, he says that this is the first taken while Quirinius was governing. It's actually a verb there, while he was governing Syria. You say, isn't the governor the one who's governing? Well, not necessarily. It depends if Luke is speaking of technically, or if he's speaking sort of in just a general sense. For example, I can speak about somebody who exercises authority, and technically, I guess they might not be holding the position of governor, but they're sort of doing the job and they're acting in a position of authority, and so they would be governing in that area. Now, to add to that point, there was a grave marker, a tombstone, called the Lapis Tiburtinus. It records the achievements of a certain governor, and the name is missing, so we don't actually know who it is, but he served as the propraetor of Syria, and he served twice. Now, the interesting thing about this is there's no record of any governor of Syria who ever served twice. So we don't know who this is, and we don't know of any governor that served twice, unless perhaps it is our old friend Quirinius. And we do know that Quirinius was in the area at an earlier date in 12 BC, or after 12 BC. He commanded the legions in Syria. And so you could say, well, that was sort of governing, one who was in command of the legions. He was the military commander. And so, indeed, this might actually fit better than we had realized. Now, the birth narratives itself. When we compare Matthew and Luke, remember, Mark doesn't really cover it. Just starts immediately with the ministry of Jesus. John speaks, sort of theologically of the birth of Jesus, but does not give a historical account of that. And so really we sort of start day one both in Luke chapter 2, the first few verses, and also in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, we read about Jesus being born in Bethlehem. Luke adds this note, might have been that night or the next night or sometime shortly thereafter. We're not given the precise time involved. The shepherds receive the visit of the angels, and the shepherds come to see the child. And so that's recorded. The shepherds are only found in Luke 2, but his birth in Bethlehem is recorded in both Luke as well as in Matthew. We come down to Luke chapter 2, verse 21, and we read about how Jesus was circumcised. Now, he didn't have to be taken anywhere. This would be something that would normally be done at home. And we're simply not told any further details, but he was circumcised on the 8th day, which was according to Jewish law. And then Luke also adds that he was presented in the temple as required by law. This is Luke chapter 2, verses 22 through 40. And so again, we know that they would have been in the area. How are they going to come to Jerusalem? Were they still staying in Bethlehem? Perhaps. It's only about 4 or 5 miles from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. And they bring Jesus to the temple and they present him. And then after that, according to Matthew chapter 2, the Magi come. And it sounds very much like they come, well, they do. We're told they come to Bethlehem. So still the family was staying there. Maybe that very night, maybe the next day. But the Magi come to worship Jesus, and they bring their gifts, and then Joseph and the family flee to Egypt. Now, the fact that there's a reference in Matthew chapter 2 when Herod questions them, and then after that he sends soldiers to kill all the children in Bethlehem who were 2 years old and younger. And people have thought, oh, gee, he must be 2 years old by now. No, not at all. The passage does not say that. Instead, it says that he's killing. You see, Herod didn't kill all of the children that were 2 years old. It was all those that were 2 years old and under. And so Herod is giving himself a safety margin. And so it might be that Jesus is only a month and a half old, maybe a little older, we're not told, but still very young, well below 1 year. And so Herod wants to make sure that he catches this young would-be king. And so he orders the death of all children 2 years old and under. And then after that, Herod gets sick and dies. So we would put the birth of Jesus sometime before April of 4 BC. How much before? We don't know. Could it have been the previous Christmas? Well, we don't know for sure that he was born at Christmas. Some people think there is a very old tradition that says he was, that it was at Christmas, right around December 25th. It's an old tradition that predates Constantine, so it's not that the Roman Emperor Constantine, who became a Christian, said that's the one we're going to celebrate. No, that tradition goes older than that, but that doesn't mean it's right either. And people have come up with some other dates, and my opinion is that, well, the scriptures don't tell us, so we shouldn't be dogmatic either.